5 years ago, April 25th, I took a walk. It was a Shabbos afternoon, but this was an unusual Shabbos walk. I walked from here about a mile southwest to Sandtown, Winchester. I walked from there downtown and stood for a while in the plaza between the War Memorial and City Hall. Later, I walked home. I covered more than 7 miles that day, but my feet were not all that weary. Abraham Joshua Heschel might have suggested it was because, just like his feet at Selma 50 years earlier, my feet had been praying. In an op-ed from the Baltimore Sun, Wes Moore, the author and nonprofit leader who contributed to Betham's capital campaign because of our work here in Reservoir Hill and spoke from this bima in 2014, explains that, quote, to understand the full tragedy of Freddie's death, we must confront the tragedy of his life. Because his death and the outbreak of anger and emotion that followed it were about much more than the police and the dire need for police reform. Moore goes on to remind us that Freddie Gray was born into poverty, that he was lead poisoned, that his mother battled the disease of drug addiction, that he puttered along in horribly subpar learning environments until he finally dropped out of school in the 10th grade at the age of 18. Of the young black man who was arrested on April 12th and who died 5 years ago this past week on April 19th, and whose funeral was held 5 years ago this coming week on April 27th, Moore writes, Freddie Gray's life was poverty and violence, trauma and hopelessness. His death was an exclamation point on an unspoken story. 6 years ago, on this Parsha, I said from this bima these exact words: the cure for a pandemic isn't simple. But here's one small place to start. Let us speak less, listen more. The rabbis point out the human head has 2 ears but only 1 mouth. Which do you think we're supposed to use more? I was talking then about the metaphorical pandemic of Lashon Hara, evil and corrosive speech, which our sages tell us metastasizes and spreads through contact like a virus. I spoke then of how we might dismantle toxic speech in person and online with humility, compassion, and by speaking less so that we might listen more. Now, I still think that that's pretty good advice, but that was 2014, the year before we lost Freddie Gray to police violence. 2 years before the nation dived headlong into an abyss of ignorance, isolationism, and hate. Now, at this Torah portion, which purportedly speaks about illness, we are in the throes of an actual pandemic, and we must ask ourselves not only if we are speaking evil less, but if we are speaking out enough. Wes Moore, in his op-ed, reminds us Dr. King once said that riots are, quote, the language of the unheard. The question we must now confront is much larger than what we are failing to hear, he writes. It is what we are failing to do about it. In 2014, when I took that 7-mile walk to join the April 25th demonstrations in West Baltimore and marched with peaceful protesters, Bethamers, friends from Jews United for Justice, and so many others to City Hall, the median income in Sandtown was $25,000. The unemployment rate was around 20%. And there was a 15-year difference in life expectancy between Freddie Gray's neighborhood 1 mile to our southwest and Roland Park less than 3 miles to our northeast. Ask yourselves today, whether you're sitting right now in Mount Washington or Roland Park or Pikesville or Canton or Reservoir Hill, do you believe those statistics have changed? What have become of the disparities, the inequities of the past 5 years or 50 years, or 150 years. We know the truth, that while some things have changed, many things have remained just about the same. And the current pandemic has made many of those things even worse. On the Yom Kippur, after the events surrounding Freddie Gray's arrest and death in police custody, I gave a sermon from this bima called Race, the Jewish Conundrum, and the Fierce Urgency of Now. I invited us to think then back to an earlier April, just blocks from where I stood with Beth Amers and other activists at City Hall 5 years ago today. I reminded us that downtown landmarks like the Holocaust Memorial and Port Discovery and Power Plant Live, now empty because of the coronavirus, were once filled with people bargaining and trading in human beings. You see, that area was the site of Baltimore's slave market. I said on that Yom Kippur, let's go back to April 19th, 1861, when an angry mob of secessionists took to rioting on Pratt Street. The first blood of the Civil War was drawn, and Baltimore was dubbed Mob Town. The day was a Friday, and that evening, a few blocks from that slave market and less than 3 miles from where you are sitting right now, I said, at Har Sinai on High Street, Rabbi David Einhorn preached a sermon excoriating prominent Rabbi Morris Jacob Rafal of New York for his support of slavery. Einhorn was, by this time, a well-known abolitionist. Within a few days, the offices of his periodical Sinai having been burned to the ground, and fearing for his family's safety, Einhorn fled Baltimore for Philadelphia, never to return. Much has changed, I said to you 5 years ago, since April 19th, 1861. I feel blessed my children will have grown up in a world where being African American and president are not mutually exclusive. But we must also lament and consider how much has not changed, because 154 years ago to the day, on April 19th, 2015, a 25-year-old man who grew up in the projects 1 mile from where you are sitting died of injuries he should never have suffered, after treatment he should never have endured. And now, Chevra, it is 159 years later. Today, the pandemic of evil speech, where politicians and pundits still sacrifice human lives on the altar of capitalism, continues to infect minds just as the virus infects and ravages more bodies. Now presidents can suggest that Americans might inject or ingest disinfectants into their bodies to fight COVID-19, and many will ridicule, but some will also listen. And too few will judge these or so many other dangerous and destructive words disqualifying. In 2020, the rabbi's linkage between Lashon Hara, evil speech, and Pilot Ra'ot, evil acts, is crystal clear. Clear, too, is the pervasiveness of structural racism. It was supposed to begin to end, at least, with the war. On January 16, 1865, Union Army General William T. Sherman issued Special Field Order No. 15, 4 days after he and Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton met with 20 leaders of the black community in Savannah, Georgia. The order stated, each family shall have a plot of not more than 40 acres of tillable ground, and when it borders on some water channel with not more than 800 feet waterfront, in the possession of which land the military authorities will afford them protection until such time as they can protect themselves, or until Congress shall regulate their title. 40 acres. The mule was added a bit later. 400,000 acres of land. extraordinary, a strip of coastline stretching from Charleston, South Carolina, to the St. Johns River in Florida, including Georgia's Sea Islands and the mainland 30 miles in from the coast, would be redistributed to newly freed, formerly enslaved human beings. Until it wasn't, because Andrew Johnson was elected, or at least Andrew Johnson became president when Lincoln was assassinated, and before he became the first of 3 presidents to be impeached by the House of Representatives, overturned the order in the fall of 1865 and returned the land to South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, the very people, writes historian Barton Myers, who had declared war on the United States of America. Reparations, says Henry Louis Gates Jr., would have fundamentally altered the course of American race relations. 1865 should have been a wake-up call, and it was for some, but not enough. 2015 should have been a wake-up call, and some were woke, but others were not. And more than 150 years after emancipation, more than 50 years after the Civil Rights Movement, in the wake of America's first black president, we are experiencing a backlash hauntingly familiar to that of Reconstruction. Miriam and I just finished watching The Plot Against America. If you haven't seen it, I commend it to you. And then you should listen to the superb podcast with NPR's Peter Sagal, who is decidedly unfunny in this podcast, and Betham's own David Simon. Now, without spoiling anything, at the very end of the final podcast, Sagal asked Simon, what is the best response to the erosion of freedom and the dangers of authoritarianism? Simon answers that, quote, the minimum is you have to vote for the idea that we share a collective governance and a collective space as Americans. The other thing that's required, David says, you have to speak out openly. You have to at least dissent to the point of opening up your throat and calling right, right, and wrong, wrong. That's the basic minimum. The world, my friends, was created with speech, according to our Torah. And it is no accident that the First Amendment of the Constitution is about speech. So I want to conclude with a passage from the Gemara, because our Parsha claims that Tzara'at, this mysterious disease, is so infectious that it can live not only within and upon human beings, but within clothing and on the walls of houses. What does the Talmud say? There has never been, nor will there ever be, a house smitten with Tzara'at. Why then, it asks, was the law given? To study it and to be rewarded for studying it. Now, you might be thinking, there are many teachings of value in the Torah. Why would the Talmud identify this particular one as being worthy of reward for its study? If our sages are right and Tzara'at is some sort of analog for speech, then we owe it to ourselves to think carefully and deeply, not just about how and when we open our ears, but when and where we use our mouths. In other words, if Tzara'at is real, if it's a thing, it can always be explained away or even dismissed. But if it is allegory and only allegory, we are forced to ask the question, for what? However, there is an infection in America today, and I am not talking about COVID-19. I am talking about lethargy. I am talking about indifference to the suffering of others. Now, I get it. It's hard to notice others suffering when we ourselves are in pain. But it's easier, too. That's the lesson of Pesach, which we so recently concluded. Our pain is instructive. The silencing of Jewish voices is meant to sensitize us to, in Dr. King's words, the language of the unheard. That's also, I would submit to you, an important lesson of Yom HaShoah. Heschel, who was supposed to host King for Passover Seder until his assassination prevented this, explained his own support for civil rights and the peace movement in an essay from 1973. The most wicked men, Heschel says, must be regarded as great teachers, for they often set forth precisely an example of that which is unqualifiedly evil. Cain's question, "Am I my brother's keeper?" and his implied negative response must be regarded among the great fundamental evil maxims of the world. There are evil men. There are malevolent policies. And, writes Heschel, in regard to cruelties committed in the name of a free society, some are guilty, while all are responsible. Or in the words of Beth Amer David Simon, who is observing yahrzeit for his father this week, democracy is so hard, and it demands so much of us every day. And whether we know it or not, we're always on tender hooks. We're always on the edge of a precipice. And the moment we start believing otherwise is the moment it gets really dangerous. Shabbat Shalom and Chodesh Tov.